The empty shampoo bottle trembled in the little boy's dirty hands as he blew the last remaining bubbles. On the park bench, a blue-eyed girl stopped screaming for the first time in hours, mesmerized by the glowing orbs dancing in the air. Hidden behind a tree, a man in an expensive suit watched the scene with tears in his eyes, unaware that he was about to discover the greatest miracle of his life. But no one could have imagined what would come next. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn wind cut through Marcus's thin jacket like a knife as he crouched behind the oak tree in Riverside Park. At 7 years old, he had learned to make himself invisible, a necessary skill when you're living on the streets of downtown Chicago. His small hands clutched a cracked plastic container filled with his homemade bubble solution, dish soap stolen from a restaurant dumpster mixed with water from the park fountain. Across the playground, chaos erupted. "Emma, please! Just calm down, sweetheart!" The woman's desperate voice pierced the afternoon air. A little girl with golden curls thrashed on the ground, her tiny fists beating against the concrete as heartbreaking sobs echoed through the park. Other children stared and pointed while their parents hurriedly gathered them up, casting uncomfortable glances at the scene. Marcus had seen this before. Same time, same bench, same little girl. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past month, the fancy black car would pull up, and the tired-looking woman would bring the crying girl to the playground. The episodes always lasted exactly 17 minutes. Marcus had counted. But today felt different. Today, something inside Marcus's chest twisted when he saw her pain. Maybe it was because he recognized that kind of helplessness. Maybe it was because no one else seemed to care. Or maybe it was simply because 7-year-old Marcus Thompson still believed in magic. Without thinking, he stepped out from behind the tree. The woman, tall, elegant, wearing clothes that probably cost more than most people made in a month, looked up with red-rimmed eyes as Marcus approached. "Oh, honey, you should probably—" Marcus didn't speak. Instead, he dipped his makeshift bubble wand into the container and began to blow. The first bubble floated toward Emma, catching the sunlight like a tiny rainbow. Then another, and another. Something miraculous happened. Emma's screaming stopped. Her little body, which had been rigid with distress, slowly relaxed. Wide blue eyes followed the dancing bubbles as they drifted around her like floating jewels. A sound escaped her lips, not a cry, but something softer, wonder. Marcus kept blowing, his heart hammering as he watched the transformation. The little girl sat up, her tear-stained face tilting toward the sky as more bubbles surrounded her. When one landed on her nose and popped with the gentlest touch, something that might have been a smile flickered across her features. "I can't believe," the woman whispered, her voice thick with emotion. From the parking lot, hidden behind tinted windows of a silver Bentley, Richard Harrison watched his daughter experience peace for the first time in months. His powerful hands, which commanded billion-dollar deals and moved markets with a single signature, trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. The scruffy little boy with dirty sneakers and holes in his jeans had just accomplished something that teams of specialists, expensive therapists, and all of Richard's money couldn't do. Emma was smiling. As the last bubble popped and dissolved into the air, Marcus caught sight of the car in the parking lot. Something about the way it sat there, engine running, made his street-smart instincts kick in. Without a word, he stuffed his bubble container into his jacket and melted back into the trees before anyone could follow. But he would be back Thursday. He had to be. Because for the first time since he'd been living in that abandoned building on 5th Street, Marcus Thompson had found something more powerful than survival. He had found purpose. Richard Harrison sat in his car for another 20 minutes, watching his daughter play peacefully on the swings while his mind raced with questions. Who was that boy? Where had he come from? And why did watching him disappear into the shadows feel like watching hope itself vanish into thin air? Thursday couldn't come soon enough. Thursday arrived with the first hint of winter's bite, and Marcus had spent 2 sleepless nights in the abandoned warehouse on 5th Street, replaying Tuesday's events over and over. His bubble container sat beside his makeshift pillow, a torn backpack stuffed with yesterday's newspapers, and he'd carefully rationed the stolen dish soap to make sure he had enough for another miracle. The warehouse was a tomb of rusted machinery and broken dreams, but it had become Marcus's sanctuary. Through a crack in the boarded window, he could see the city waking up. Office workers clutching coffee cups, mothers pushing strollers, children walking to school with backpacks bigger than they were. A world that moved around him, but never included him. Until Tuesday. Until Emma. At 3:47 p.m. exactly, the silver Bentley pulled into Riverside Park's parking lot. Marcus had been watching from behind the oak tree for 20 minutes, his heart hammering with an emotion he couldn't name. Anticipation, fear, hope. This time, Marcus was ready. He watched from his hiding spot as the woman helped Emma out of the car. Sarah. He'd learned her name from eavesdropping on their conversations. Today, the little girl seemed different, less agitated, more alert. She kept looking around the playground with those bright blue eyes, as if searching for something precious she'd lost. Or someone. "Looking for your bubble friend, aren't you, sweetheart?" Sarah's voice carried across the autumn air, mixing hope with bone-deep exhaustion. "I know you are. Mommy's looking for him too." Marcus's breath caught. Emma had been looking for him. Someone had been thinking about him, missing him. When was the last time that had happened? Emma's small voice whispered something that made Marcus's chest tighten. "Bubble boy, where Bubble boy?" The words were clear, deliberate. Sarah gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "Oh, Emma, you spoke! You beautiful, brilliant girl!" From his hiding spot, Marcus watched Emma's face crumple as the familiar distress began building. Her tiny hands started flapping. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The meltdown was coming, and Marcus knew he had exactly 30 seconds before she was lost to the chaos in her mind. This time he didn't hesitate. Marcus emerged from the trees like a guardian angel carrying salvation in a cracked plastic container. The bubble solution caught the afternoon sunlight as he worked his magic, but something felt different today. More sacred, more purposeful. As the first bubble floated toward Emma, her agitation stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. Her little body, which had been coiling like a spring, slowly relaxed. But something else happened. Something that made Sarah's hand fly to her mouth in shock. Emma reached out her tiny hand toward Marcus, not to the bubbles dancing around her like floating jewels, but to him, to the boy with holes in his shoes and dirt under his fingernails, who somehow understood her better than anyone else in the world. From the parking lot, hidden behind the tinted windows of his Bentley, Richard Harrison watched his daughter reach toward hope incarnate. His powerful hands, which commanded billion-dollar deals and moved international markets with a single signature, trembled as they gripped the leather steering wheel. The scruffy little boy, with mismatched socks and a jacket 3 sizes too big, had just accomplished something that teams of specialists, expensive therapists, and all of Richard's vast fortune couldn't do. Emma was not just smiling, she was connecting. Richard Harrison, CEO of Harrison Industries, a man who'd built an empire through calculated risks and cold logic, made the most important decision of his life. He opened the car door and stepped into the unknown. Richard Harrison had negotiated billion-dollar mergers with oil sheiks, faced down hostile takeovers from corporate raiders, and commanded boardrooms filled with the most ruthless men in Chicago. But approaching a 7-year-old homeless boy felt like the most important and terrifying meeting of his life. Marcus saw him coming and froze like a deer in headlights. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run. The man was tall, imposing, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in 6 months. His shoes alone looked like they could feed Marcus for a week. This was money, this was power, this was danger. "Wait," Richard called softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Please don't go. I'm not here to hurt you." The desperation in his voice, raw, unguarded, completely at odds with his corporate armor, stopped Marcus cold. This wasn't the tone of someone trying to cause trouble or call the authorities. This was the voice of a father who just watched his daughter experience a miracle. "I just want to talk. Please." Marcus clutched his bubble container tighter, ready to bolt if this went wrong. But Emma was watching him with those trusting blue eyes, and something about this man's energy felt safe, broken maybe, but safe. "My name is Richard," he said, slowly crouching down to Marcus's eye level. The movement brought him into the little boy's world instead of looming over it. "What's yours?" Marcus studied the man's face. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. His expression was open, vulnerable in a way that seemed foreign to someone who clearly lived in boardrooms and corner offices. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Marcus." Richard repeated the name like it was something precious, something worth treasuring. That's a strong name, a warrior's name. Nobody had ever said anything like that about Marcus before. He'd always thought his name was just a name, something his mother had picked out of a book maybe. "What you did for my daughter," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "What you're doing for her, it's nothing short of a miracle. Emma has autism, and she hasn't had a peaceful moment in months. The doctors said she might never connect with another person. But you gave her peace, you gave her connection, you gave her hope." Sarah approached carefully, Emma's hand secured in hers, but the little girl was straining toward Marcus with an intensity that took everyone's breath away. "The specialists we've consulted," Sarah said softly. "They've tried everything. Behavioral therapy, sensory integration, specialized communication tools. Nothing worked. But you. In 5 minutes, you did what a team of experts couldn't do in 6 months. Marcus looked down at his dirty sneakers, feeling heat creep up his neck. "I just blow bubbles. It's not special." "No," Richard said, with surprising firmness. "You do much more than that. You see her, Marcus, really see her. Not her diagnosis, not her challenges, not the way she's different from other children. You see Emma. Do you understand how rare that is? How precious?" For the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Someone saw value in what he could do. Someone saw value in him. Not as a charity case or a problem to be solved, but as a person who mattered. "Where are your parents, Marcus?" Richard asked gently, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. The warmth died instantly. Marcus's jaw tightened and his walls slammed back into place. "Don't have any." "Where do you live?" "Around." The word was clipped, defensive. Richard and Sarah exchanged a look loaded with meaning. They both knew what around meant for a child this young, this thin, this obviously alone. "Marcus," Richard said carefully as if he were defusing a bomb, "would you like to have lunch with us? Nothing complicated, no strings attached, just lunch." "Emma would like that very much, wouldn't you, sweetheart?" Emma nodded so emphatically that her golden curls bounced, and then she did something that made all 3 adults catch their breath in wonder. She let go of Sarah's hand and took a tentative step toward Marcus. Marcus's carefully constructed defenses crumbled like sandcastles before a tide. When was the last time someone had wanted his company? When was the last time he'd mattered to anyone enough that they'd seek him out? "Okay," he whispered, the word barely more than breath. But as they walked toward the gleaming Bentley, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was a doorway he couldn't walk back through. And change, in his hard-earned experience, usually meant loss. The restaurant Richard chose was nothing like the soup kitchens where Marcus occasionally managed to get a meal, if he was lucky, and fast enough to avoid the older kids who'd steal his food. This place had crystal glasses that caught the light like diamonds, white tablecloths that had never seen a stain, and waiters who moved with the practiced grace of dancers. Marcus felt every stare, every whispered comment, every judgmental glance directed at the dirty boy at table 12. His jacket, which had seemed adequate in the warehouse, suddenly felt like a costume from another century. The holes in his jeans seemed to glow under the restaurant's warm lighting. But Richard's calm voice cut through his mounting embarrassment like a lifeline. "Emma, why don't you show Marcus how you like your water with exactly 3 ice cubes?" "It's a very important ritual, isn't it?" As Emma carefully arranged her ice cubes with the focused intensity of a master craftsman, Marcus felt his shoulders relax slightly. Richard wasn't trying to change him or fix him or make him into someone else. He was just including him, making space for him in their world. The food, when it came, was unlike anything Marcus had ever tasted. Fresh bread that was still warm, soup that hadn't come from a can, vegetables that actually had flavor. He tried to eat slowly, to have manners, but hunger won out. He'd learned not to waste food when you didn't know where the next meal was coming from. "How long have you been on your own, Marcus?" Sarah asked gently, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that was still burning. 2 years, maybe 3. Hard to keep track when every day is about surviving to see the next one. What happened to your family? The question was soft, but Marcus felt it like a physical blow. He set down his fork, appetite evaporating like morning mist. The warmth of the restaurant couldn't touch the cold that suddenly filled his chest. Mom got sick, real sick. Cancer, the doctors called it. But I was too young to understand what that meant. All I knew was that she kept getting smaller and smaller until she looked like a ghost of herself. Sarah's hand moved toward him across the table but stopped short, respecting his space. "Dad couldn't handle watching her die," Marcus continued, his voice mechanical, practiced from years of not thinking too hard about the details. "He started drinking. Then he started leaving for days at a time. Then one day he just didn't come back. Mom died when I was 5, alone in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams." Richard's hands clenched on the white tablecloth, his knuckles going white. "Foster care. Tried that. Didn't work out." Marcus's voice was flat, emotionless. "Some families want perfect children who say thank you and smile on command. Some want extra money from the state. None of them wanted a kid who had nightmares every night and couldn't trust anyone not to leave." "That's not true," Richard said with surprising intensity, his voice carrying an edge that made Marcus look up sharply. "Everyone deserves a family. Everyone deserves love." Something in his tone made Marcus study the man's face more carefully. There was pain there, old and deep and carefully hidden beneath layers of success and control. "You sound like you know something about that," Marcus said quietly. Richard's smile was bitter, full of regret. "I do. I lost my brother years ago. Said things I can't take back. Did things I regret every single day, chose money and pride over family, and by the time I realized what an idiot I'd been, it was too late." Sarah reached across the table and touched Richard's hand with gentle familiarity. Marcus caught the gesture and felt a sharp stab of something that might have been envy. When was the last time someone had comforted him? When was the last time someone had cared enough to offer comfort? Emma, who had been quietly eating and observing everything with her bright, intelligent eyes, suddenly stood up and walked around the table with purpose. Without warning or hesitation, she climbed into Marcus's lap and rested her head against his chest with complete trust. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard's eyes filled with tears that he didn't bother to hide. "She's never done that," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "Not with anyone. Not even with us. She doesn't. She can't usually tolerate physical contact." Marcus's arms came up instinctively to hold the little girl, and for a moment that felt both eternal and far too brief, he experienced something he'd forgotten existed: belonging, connection, the feeling that he mattered to someone in the world. But the warmth was quickly replaced by a familiar, crushing fear, because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability on the streets could get you killed. Worse than that, caring meant having something to lose, and Marcus had already lost everything once. He wasn't sure he could survive it happening again. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The warehouse felt colder and more desolate than usual, and every time he closed his eyes, he felt Emma's small weight against his chest, heard Richard's voice saying, "Everyone deserves a family," saw the hope in Sarah's eyes when Emma had spoken his name. Hope was dangerous for someone like him. Hope made you soft, made you vulnerable, made you believe in things that couldn't last. But it was growing anyway, stubborn as weeds pushing through concrete, impossible to uproot once it had taken hold. The next morning, Marcus found himself drawn back to Riverside Park like a moth to flame. He told himself he was just checking to make sure Emma was okay, but deep down he knew he was looking for something else. Something he'd never had and wasn't sure he deserved. Richard was already there, sitting on Emma's favorite bench, staring out at the empty playground with the expression of a man wrestling with the biggest decision of his life. "I've been thinking," Richard said as Marcus approached, not seeming surprised to see him, "about what you said yesterday, about not being meant for families." Marcus stiffened, his defenses automatically slamming into place. "Look, yesterday was nice, but I don't need charity." "I want to offer you something," Richard interrupted, his voice steady and sure. "A home. With us. Not charity, not foster care, not some temporary arrangement. A real home, with people who see your worth and want you in their lives." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making the world tilt on its axis. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I've had to do to survive." "I know enough." Richard's voice was calm but filled with conviction. "I know you're kind. It takes a special heart to see a stranger's pain and want to heal it. I know you're brave. You could have stayed hidden in the shadows, but you chose to step into the light to help Emma. I know you're resilient. Surviving on the streets for years requires strength most adults don't possess." "I'm street trash," Marcus said harshly, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "I steal food from dumpsters. I haven't had a real bath in weeks. I don't know how to use proper silverware or say please and thank you at the right times. I don't know how to be in a family. None of that matters." "It does matter." Marcus jumped up, his voice cracking with emotion. "You live in a different world. I saw that restaurant yesterday, saw how people looked at me. I don't fit in places like that. I don't fit anywhere." Richard stood too, his movements careful and deliberate. "My brother's name was David. He was 2 years younger than me, and when our parents died in a car accident, I was supposed to take care of him. Instead, I abandoned him because I was too proud, too focused on building my empire, too convinced that success mattered more than family." Marcus saw the raw pain in Richard's eyes and felt his anger deflate like a punctured balloon. "I chose money over love, ambition over loyalty, pride over family, and I lost him forever because of it." Richard's voice was barely above a whisper now. "I can't bring David back. I can't undo the mistakes I made or take back the words that drove him away. But I can choose differently now. I can choose you. Emma has already chosen you. She's never connected with anyone the way she's connected with you. For a terrifying, wonderful moment, Marcus let himself imagine it. A warm bed with clean sheets, regular meals at a table where he belonged. Emma's laughter filling spaces that had been empty for too long. A father figure who saw value in him, who wanted him around, not because he had to, but because he chose to. But then reality crashed back like a cold wave. People like him didn't get fairy tale endings. They got disappointment and abandonment and broken promises. They got people who changed their minds when things got difficult. "I need time to think," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Richard nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, thick, expensive paper with embossed lettering that screamed success and power. "My phone number, all of my phone numbers. Call me when you're ready, but Marcus." Richard's voice carried an urgency that made the boy look up. "Don't wait too long. Sometimes the best things in life have expiration dates. Sometimes second chances don't come around again." As Richard walked away toward his gleaming Bentley, Marcus stared at the card in his trembling hands, unaware that time was already running out in ways none of them could imagine. Unaware that the headaches that had been plaguing him for weeks were getting worse. Unaware that the universe had a cruel sense of timing when it came to hope and heartbreak. Marcus spent 3 days avoiding the park, sleeping in different doorways and abandoned buildings, moving constantly to stay ahead of the security guards and police who saw homeless children as problems to be solved rather than people who needed help. He tried to convince himself that walking away was the smart choice, the safe choice, the only choice that made sense for someone like him. But Sunday morning brought hunger and something stronger. A pull he couldn't resist, a need to see Emma's face and know she was okay. Against every survival instinct he'd developed, Marcus found himself walking back to Riverside Park as the sun painted the sky in shades of hope and possibility. He found Richard sitting alone on Emma's favorite bench, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. The man's head was in his hands, and his shoulders shook with barely contained emotion. "Where is she?" Marcus asked, alarmed by Richard's obvious distress. Richard looked up, and Marcus was shocked to see tear tracks on the face of this powerful man who commanded corporate empires with cool precision. "Emergency room. She had a severe episode yesterday, worse than anything we've seen since before you came into our lives." Guilt hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest. "Is she okay? Is she hurt?" "She will be. The doctors had to sedate her to stop the self-harm. But even unconscious, she kept asking for Bubble Boy. Over and over, your name was the only thing that could penetrate the haze of medication." Richard's voice broke completely. "She's been asking for you, Marcus, for 3 days straight. Sarah thinks. We both think the episode happened because you disappeared, because she thought you'd abandoned her like everyone else in her life has." Without thinking, Marcus sat beside Richard on the bench that had become sacred ground for all of them. "I'm sorry. I was scared. I am scared." "Of what? Of us? Of me? Of caring too much? Of letting myself believe this could be real? Of you changing your mind when you realize what you're really signing up for?" "Do." The words tumbled out before Marcus could stop them, years of pain and abandonment spilling over like water from a broken dam. "Everyone I've ever cared about leaves or dies. Maybe it's better if I just stay away, if I don't let myself want things I can't have." "Stop!" Richard's voice was sharp, commanding. "Look at me, son." The word son hit Marcus in the chest like lightning, stealing his breath and making his heart stutter. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone," Richard said, his voice heavy with the weight of long-carried secrets. "When David was 7, your age exactly, he got sick, really sick, leukemia. The doctors said he needed experimental treatment, the kind that insurance companies call investigational, so they don't have to pay for it. Marcus stared at him, feeling pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed begin to fall into place. I could have paid for it myself. Even then, barely 25, and just starting to build my fortune, I had enough money to save his life 10 times over. But I was young and stupid and angry at the world for taking our parents. I told him the family couldn't afford it, that we'd have to hope the standard treatment would work. And the park seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the rest of the story. It didn't work. David died believing I didn't love him enough to save him. The truth was, I had millions even then, sitting in accounts I'd barely touched. I was just too proud to spend it on what I saw as charity, too convinced that people should fight their own battles. Richard's voice was barely a whisper now. I let my little brother die because of my ego, because I was too proud to admit that love was more important than teaching lessons about self-reliance. "That's why you want to help me," Marcus said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. "No." Richard turned to face him fully, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I want to help you because you remind me of the man David could have become. Kind enough to help a stranger's child. Brave enough to step into the unknown to ease someone else's pain. Strong enough to survive impossible circumstances and still have compassion left to give." Richard pulled out his phone with shaking hands and showed Marcus a faded photograph. "This was taken at David's funeral. Do you see that woman in the background? The one who's pregnant and crying like her world just ended?" Marcus looked closer, squinting at the small figure in the background of the photo. There was something familiar about her face, about the way she held herself, about her eyes. Her name was Jennifer Thompson. She was David's girlfriend, the love of his young life. She was carrying his baby, carrying the future we all thought we'd lost forever. The world tilted dangerously, and Marcus felt like he was falling through space and time. Thompson, his mother's name, his mother's face, younger but unmistakable. After David died, she disappeared, devastated by grief and terrified of facing me, the brother who'd let David die. I tried to find her, hired investigators, followed every lead, but it was like she'd vanished from the earth. Richard's voice was shaking now, barely controlled. "Marcus, what was your mother's full name?" "Jennifer," Marcus whispered, the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. "Jennifer Marie Thompson. And you said your father left when you were 5. Marcus nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. "He didn't leave, son. He died. He died in a car accident when you were 5, devastated by the loss of your mother to cancer and struggling to raise you alone. But before that, before the cancer, before the drinking, before the despair, he was my little brother David, the boy I was supposed to protect and failed." The park spun around Marcus as the truth crashed over him like a tsunami. Richard wasn't just a kind stranger offering charity to a homeless child. Richard wasn't just Emma's father looking for someone to help his daughter heal. Richard was his uncle, his blood, his family, the last family he had left in the world. But as Marcus looked into Richard's desperate, loving eyes, eyes that suddenly looked so much like his father's, a cold dread began building in his stomach, like ice forming over still water. Because there was one more secret, one he'd been hiding from everyone, including himself, the headaches that came every morning now, sharp and relentless. The dizzy spells that left him gripping walls and trees for support. The bruises that appeared on his body without explanation, purple and green marks that spoke of something wrong beneath the surface. Marcus Thompson had found his family just in time to lose them all over again. Because something was very, very wrong with his body, and he was terrified that the universe was about to play the cruelest joke of all, giving him everything he'd ever wanted just long enough to take it away forever. The Harrison mansion in Lincoln Park was everything Marcus had imagined wealth looked like, yet nothing could have prepared him for the reality of stepping into a world where marble floors gleamed like mirrors and crystal chandeliers cast rainbows on walls lined with original artwork worth more than entire city blocks. But it was Emma's reaction that shattered every preconception Marcus had about this new life. "Bubble boy!" she shrieked with pure joy, breaking free from Sarah's grip and launching herself into Marcus's arms with the force of a small missile. Her laughter, bright and musical, echoed through the grand foyer like church bells announcing a miracle. "I missed you too, little one," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion he didn't know how to process. 3 days apart had felt like 3 years, and holding Emma again made something in his chest loosen and tighten simultaneously. Richard watched the reunion with tears he didn't try to hide. "Welcome home, Marcus." Home. The word felt foreign on Marcus's tongue, like speaking a language he'd forgotten he once knew. The house tour that followed was a blur of rooms bigger than the entire warehouse where he'd been living, bathrooms with marble fixtures that sparkled like jewels, and a bedroom that Richard said was his. Actually his, not borrowed or temporary or conditional. "This was going to be David's room," Richard explained quietly as they stood in the doorway of a space that looked like it belonged in a magazine. "I had it designed for the son I thought I'd never find. Now I know why it never felt complete. It was waiting for you." That night, Marcus lay in a bed so soft it felt like floating on clouds, staring at a ceiling that didn't leak or threaten to collapse. The sheets smelled like lavender and sunshine instead of mildew and despair. Everything should have been perfect, so why did he feel like he was dying? The headache that had been his constant companion for weeks pounded behind his eyes with renewed vengeance. His vision blurred when he sat up too quickly, and there was a strange metallic taste in his mouth that no amount of the fancy toothpaste could wash away. Marcus pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to massage away the pain that seemed to be growing stronger each day. Tomorrow, Richard had mentioned, they'd start the process of making everything official. Legal paperwork, medical exams, school enrollment, all the things that would transform Marcus Thompson from a street kid into Marcus Harrison, beloved nephew and son. If only he could shake the feeling that time was running out faster than he could run toward his new life. Down the hall, Emma slept peacefully for the first time in months, her bubble maker close enough to feel safe. In the master bedroom, Richard stared at the ceiling and planned the future he'd dreamed of for 20 years. And in his perfect new room, Marcus fought back nausea and tried to ignore the bruises spreading across his ribs like dark flowers blooming under his skin. Something was very wrong, but Marcus had spent too many years surviving to waste this gift by worrying about shadows. Whatever was happening to his body, he'd figure it out. He had to. He finally had everything he'd ever wanted. He couldn't lose it now. Dr. Catherine Mills had been Richard Harrison's personal physician for 15 years, long enough to see him through stress-induced health scares and the occasional corporate battle that left him physically and emotionally drained. But she'd never seen him as tense as he was now, pacing her office while waiting for Marcus's comprehensive medical evaluation to conclude. "Richard, you need to sit down before you wear a hole in my carpet," she said gently, but her attention was focused on the test results spreading across her desk, like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. "How much longer?" Richard asked, checking his watch for the 20th time in 10 minutes. "He's been back there for 2 hours. Comprehensive blood work takes time. We're being thorough because you want to be thorough. That's good parenting." The word parenting made Richard's chest warm despite his anxiety. 3 weeks of having Marcus in his life had transformed him in ways he hadn't expected. The boy who'd started as David's legacy had become Richard's second chance at being the man his brother deserved. Marcus had been the perfect house-guest-turned-family member, polite, grateful, eager to help with Emma's care, and surprisingly adaptable to a lifestyle that must have felt like stepping into an alien world. The only concerning thing was how tired he seemed, how often Richard caught him massaging his temples or closing his eyes like he was fighting off dizziness. Probably just stress from the life change, Richard had told himself. Poor nutrition catching up with him, normal adjustment challenges. Dr. D. Mills returned to her desk and began organizing papers with the methodical precision that had made her one of Chicago's most respected physicians. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Richard had known her long enough to recognize the subtle tells that indicated serious news. "Richard, I need you to sit down." The words hit him like ice water. "What's wrong?" Marcus's blood work shows some abnormalities that require immediate follow-up. His white blood cell count is severely elevated, his red blood cell count is dangerously low, and his platelet levels are... She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They're consistent with a serious hematological condition." Richard felt the room tilt. "What does that mean in English, Catherine?" "It means we need to get Marcus to a specialist immediately, today." These numbers, combined with the symptoms you've described, the fatigue, headaches, easy bruising, they're indicating something that requires urgent intervention. The door to the examination room opened, and Marcus emerged looking pale and unsteady. Richard was beside him in an instant, steadying him with hands that shook despite his effort to appear calm. "Hey, buddy. How are you feeling?" "Tired," Marcus admitted, leaning into Richard's support in a way that made the man's heart clench. "Really tired. And the room keeps spinning." "Doctor." Mills approached them with the gentle authority that had guided countless families through medical crises. "Marcus, I need to ask you something important. Have you been feeling sick for a while? Maybe weeks or months?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Started on the streets, thought it was just hunger, you know. Hunger. Hard to tell the difference when you're always hungry anyway." "You should have told me," Richard said softly, his voice full of guilt. "I should have noticed." "I didn't want you to change your mind about keeping me," Marcus whispered, the admission breaking Richard's heart into fragments. "I thought if I was sick, you'd send me away." Richard knelt down to Marcus's eye level, taking the boy's thin hands in his own. "Listen to me very carefully. Nothing, and I mean nothing, will ever make me send you away. You're my family. You're my son. Whatever's happening, we'll face it together." Dr. Mills cleared her throat gently. "I've arranged for you to see Dr. James Morrison at Chicago Children's Hospital within the hour. He's one of the best pediatric hematologists in the country." "Hematologist?" Marcus asked, the unfamiliar word heavy on his tongue. "A blood doctor," Richard explained, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "Someone who specializes in making sure your blood is working the way it should." As they left Dr. Mills's office, Marcus stumbled slightly, and Richard caught him with reflexes sharpened by weeks of watching Emma for signs of distress. But this was different. This was his nephew, his son, fighting something invisible and potentially devastating. "Uncle Richard," Marcus said quietly as they walked toward the car. "Yeah, buddy." "I'm scared." Richard stopped walking and pulled Marcus into the fierce, protective embrace he should have given David 20 years ago. "Me too, son. But we're going to fight this together. Whatever it is, however bad it gets, you're not alone anymore." "Nee." He just prayed it wasn't already too late. Dr. James Morrison had delivered devastating news to families for 27 years, but something about the 7-year-old boy sitting between Richard Harrison and Sarah Clark made this particular conversation feel like defusing a bomb. Marcus held Emma's hand on one side and gripped Richard's fingers on the other, his young face pale but determined. "The tests confirm what we suspected," Dr. Morrison said gently, his voice carrying the weight of experience and compassion. Marcus has acute lymphoblastic leukemia. All. It's a cancer of the blood and bone marrow. Ooh, the words hit the room like a physical force. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the chest, all the air leaving his lungs in a rush. But it was Marcus's reaction that broke everyone's heart. "Am I going to die?" he asked with the matter-of-fact directness that only children possess, his voice small but steady. Dr. Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "That's not a question I can answer with absolute certainty, Marcus. But I can tell you this. Pediatric All has a cure rate of about 85% with current treatments. Those are very good odds." "What about the other 15%? Marcus pressed, because life on the streets had taught him that adults often hid the most important information. "We'll cross that bridge if we come to it," Richard said firmly, squeezing Marcus's hand. "Right now, we focus on getting you well." Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. "Treatment will be intensive. Chemotherapy, possibly radiation, definitely a long hospital stay initially. It's going to be hard, Marcus. Harder than anything you've probably faced, even living on the streets." "Will I lose my hair?" Marcus asked, unconsciously touching his dark curls. "Probably, but it'll grow back. Everything that treatment takes away will help you get back." Emma, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the adult conversation, suddenly stood up and walked to Dr. Morrison's desk. She picked up a pen and drew something on a piece of paper, then brought it back to Marcus. It was a stick figure with curly hair surrounded by bubbles, and underneath, in Emma's careful 7-year-old handwriting, "Best friend forever." Marcus started crying then, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that for the first time in his life, he had people who would fight for him, people who saw him as worth saving. "When do we start?" Richard asked, his voice thick with determination and barely controlled emotion. "Immediately, this afternoon if possible. The sooner we begin treatment, the better Marcus's chances of beating this thing completely." Over the next hour, Dr. Morrison explained the treatment protocol with clinical precision, tempered by genuine compassion. Port placement for chemotherapy, spinal taps to check for cancer cells in the central nervous system, bone marrow biopsies to monitor response to treatment. Medical terms that sounded like a foreign language but would soon become as familiar as breathing. "There's something else we need to discuss," Dr. Morrison said, as they prepared to leave for Marcus's immediate admission. "The financial aspect. Treatment for pediatric leukemia can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and insurance companies can be challenging." Richard's expression hardened, and for a moment, the corporate shark that had built a billion-dollar empire emerged from behind the worried uncle facade. "Money is not a factor. Whatever Marcus needs, he gets. The best doctors, the best treatments, the best facilities. I don't care what it costs." "Uncle Richard," Marcus said quietly, "what if the treatment doesn't work? What if you spend all that money and I still—" "Stop." Richard's voice was gentle but absolutely firm. "Do you remember what I told you about David? About how I let pride and fear keep me from spending money to save someone I loved?" Marcus nodded. "I won't make that mistake again. Ever. You are worth every penny, every resource, every ounce of fight I have in me. This family doesn't give up on each other." As they walked toward the hospital's children's wing, Marcus, carrying the small overnight bag Sarah had packed with his few possessions, he couldn't help but think about the cruel irony of his situation. He'd spent years believing he was worthless, unwanted, destined to die alone on the streets. Now, surrounded by more love and support than he'd ever dreamed possible, death was still stalking him, just wearing a different face. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone. This time, he had Uncle Richard's fierce determination, Sarah's gentle strength, and Emma's unshakable faith that bubble boys were magic and magic was stronger than anything. It would have to be enough. Because Marcus Thompson, now Marcus Harrison, in everything but legal documentation, was just getting started with living. 6 weeks into treatment, Marcus looked like a ghost of the boy who'd first blown bubbles for Emma in Riverside Park. Chemotherapy had stolen his hair, hollowed his cheeks, and left him so weak that walking to the bathroom required assistance. But his spirit, that indefinable spark that had drawn Richard to him from the beginning, burned as bright as ever. "The numbers aren't improving as much as we'd hoped," Dr. Morrison explained to Richard during one of their regular consultations. They stood outside Marcus's room, speaking in hushed tones, while the boy slept off the latest round of treatment. "He's not responding to the standard protocol the way most children do." Richard felt familiar ice forming in his chest. "What does that mean?" "It means we need to consider more aggressive options. There's an experimental treatment being trialed at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, CAR T-cell therapy. It's showing promising results for cases like Marcus's." "Experimental," Richard repeated, the word tasting like ashes. "The treatment involves extracting Marcus's T-cells, genetically modifying them to better fight the cancer, then reinfusing them. It's cutting-edge, expensive, and—" Dr. Morrison paused. "It's not covered by insurance. Even for someone with your resources, we're talking about $1 million. Minimum." Through the window, Richard could see Marcus stirring in his hospital bed, automatically reaching for the bubble container that never left his bedside table. Even in his weakest moments, the boy's first thought was always about being ready to comfort Emma during her daily visits. "Set it up," Richard said without hesitation. "Richard, you should know that experimental treatments come with significant risks. Set it up." Richard's voice carried the absolute authority that had made him one of Chicago's most feared negotiators. "I don't care about the cost. I don't care about the risks. I care about giving my son every possible chance to live." "Doctor." Morrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There's something else. Something I discovered when reviewing Marcus's family medical history for the experimental protocol." Richard turned from the window, every instinct suddenly alert. "When you provided information about David's death, you mentioned it was a car accident when Marcus was 5. But Marcus's medical records from his brief time in foster care tell a different story." The world seemed to slow around Richard. "What do you mean?" "David Thompson died of complications from leukemia, Richard. The same type Marcus has now. It's often hereditary, passed from parent to child." Richard gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white. "That's impossible. David died in a car accident. I know because I was there. I spoke at his funeral. I think you need to sit down." "Doctor." Morrison led Richard to a private consultation room and spread out medical records, death certificates, and documentation that painted a picture Richard had never imagined possible. "David didn't die in a car accident," Dr. Morrison said gently. "He died from leukemia when Marcus was 5 years old. The same experimental treatment I'm recommending for Marcus was still in early trials then. It wasn't available to save your brother." Richard stared at the papers, his mind racing. "But Jennifer told Marcus his father left them. She told him David abandoned them. Probably to protect a 5-year-old from the trauma of watching his father die slowly from cancer. She created a story that would hurt less than the truth." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. David hadn't abandoned his family. David had fought for his life, fought to stay with Jennifer and baby Marcus, and lost the battle that Marcus was now fighting. "There's more," Dr. Morrison continued. "The experimental treatment that might save Marcus, it's based on research that began with David's case. Your brother's death helped develop the therapy that could save his son." Richard buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the cosmic poetry of the situation. David's sacrifice might be the key to Marcus's survival. The brother he'd failed to save had become the pathway to saving the nephew he'd found just in time. "Dr. Morrison," Richard said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face, "how quickly can we get Marcus to St. Jude's? The transport team can be here tomorrow morning if you approve the transfer." "Do it, and doctor." Richard stood, his expression transformed from grieving uncle to determined warrior. "I want the best team, the best equipment, the best everything. Money is no object. Marcus Harrison is going to beat this thing, and David's legacy is going to live on through his son." As Richard walked back to Marcus's room, he found the boy awake and watching Emma play with bubbles in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. "Uncle Richard," Marcus said softly, "I had a dream about my dad. He told me not to be scared, that everything happens for a reason." Richard sat on the edge of the bed and took Marcus's thin hand in his own. "What else did he say?" "He said he was proud of me, and that he was proud of you for not giving up." Richard's voice broke as he whispered, "We're going to Memphis tomorrow, buddy. We're going to try something that might make you completely better. Even if it doesn't work," Marcus said with wisdom far beyond his 7 years, "I'm glad I got to have a family first. I'm glad I got to know what love feels like." "It's going to work," Richard said fiercely. "It has to work. Because David didn't fight and lose so that you could fight and lose too. He fought so that when your time came, the weapons would be ready." Outside the window, Emma's bubbles caught the light like tiny miracles, floating on air currents that seemed to carry the hopes and dreams of everyone who'd ever loved a child fighting for their life. Tomorrow, they would begin the battle for Marcus's future. Tonight, they were a family, complete and unbroken, preparing to face whatever came next together. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital rose from the Memphis landscape like a fortress of hope, its modern glass and steel structure gleaming in the early morning sun. Richard had flown them down in his private jet the night before, transforming the aircraft's cabin into a mobile pediatric unit with medical equipment and a team of nurses to monitor Marcus during the flight. Now, as they wheeled Marcus through corridors filled with children fighting battles that would challenge grown men, Richard felt the weight of every decision that had led them to this moment. "It's like a spaceship," Marcus whispered, his voice weak but filled with wonder as they passed laboratories where scientists in white coats worked over microscopes and computer screens. "Are they really going to take my blood and turn it into super soldier serum?" "Doctor?" Sarah Chen, the lead researcher on the CAR T-cell therapy program, smiled at Marcus's description. "That's actually not a bad way to think about it. We're going to teach your T-cells to be better fighters against the cancer." Emma, who had insisted on making the trip despite Sarah's concerns about exposing her to the hospital environment, walked beside Marcus's wheelchair carrying a new bubble solution Richard had bought at the Memphis airport. She hadn't spoken since they'd landed, but her presence seemed to give Marcus strength that no medicine could provide. "The process will take about 2 weeks, Dr. Chen explained as they entered Marcus's room in the research wing. "First, we extract your T-cells through a process called leukapheresis. Then we send them to our laboratory, where they're genetically modified to better recognize and attack leukemia cells. While we're preparing your super soldier cells, you'll undergo conditioning chemotherapy to make room for the new treatment." Richard listened to every word, taking notes and asking detailed questions that demonstrated the same thoroughness that had built his business empire, but underneath the composed exterior, terror clawed at his chest. This was their last best hope, if the experimental treatment failed. "Uncle Richard?" Marcus's voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything, buddy. If this doesn't work, will you make sure Emma knows I didn't leave her on purpose? Will you tell her that bubble boys never really disappear? They just become invisible so they can protect people better." The question hit Richard like a physical blow. But before he could respond, Emma surprised everyone by speaking for the first time since they'd arrived in Memphis. "Marcus, not leaving," she said with absolute certainty, climbing onto his hospital bed with the confidence of someone who understood truths that adults couldn't see. "Bubble magic too strong. Bubble boys don't disappear." Dr. Chen watched the interaction with professional interest. "The bond between you two is remarkable. Studies have shown that strong emotional connections can actually boost immune system response during treatment." "She saved me first," Marcus said softly, stroking Emma's hair. "Before Uncle Richard, before this family, there was Emma. She was the first person who made me want to live instead of just survive." That evening, as Marcus underwent the first phase of the leukapheresis procedure, Richard found himself in the hospital chapel, a space he hadn't visited since David's funeral 20 years earlier. "I know we haven't talked in a while," he whispered to the stained glass windows that caught the last light of the Memphis sunset. "I know I blamed you when David died, blamed myself, blamed everyone except the cancer that actually killed him. But if you're listening, Marcus is a good kid, the best kid. He deserves the chance David never got." "Mr. Harrison?" Richard turned to find Dr. Chen standing in the chapel doorway, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with something that might have been excitement. "Is everything okay? Is Marcus—" "Marcus is fine. Better than fine, actually. I wanted to share something with you about his T-cell extraction." She sat beside him in the pew, her voice dropping to a whisper. "His cellular response is unlike anything we've seen in the trial so far. It's almost like his immune system has been preparing for this fight, building defenses that most patients don't have." "What does that mean?" "It means that sometimes genetics that can hurt you can also save you. The same hereditary factors that made Marcus susceptible to leukemia seem to be making him an ideal candidate for this treatment. His T-cells are responding to modification better than we dared hope." Richard felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but something close to hope. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. "When we reviewed the research history that led to this treatment, we found that one of the foundational cases was a patient named David Thompson, treated here nearly 15 years ago. His case helped us understand the genetic markers we're targeting now." Richard's breath caught. "David helped create the treatment that might save Marcus?" "More than that. Without David's contribution to our research, this therapy might not exist. In a very real sense, your brother is helping us save his son." As they sat in the chapel where desperate families had prayed for miracles for decades, Richard finally understood what Emma had known all along. Some magic was too strong to break. Some love was too powerful to be defeated by cancer or time or even death. Tomorrow, Marcus would begin the most dangerous phase of his treatment. But tonight, surrounded by the love of his chosen family and the legacy of his father's sacrifice, he was already winning the most important battle of all, the battle to matter, the battle to be loved, the battle to know that some bonds are stronger than anything that tries to break them. "Thank you, David," Richard whispered to his brother's memory. "Thank you for showing us how to fight." 6 months later, Riverside Park looked exactly the same as it had on that autumn day when Marcus first stepped out from behind the oak tree with his cracked plastic container. But everything else had changed in ways that defied medical explanation and humbled even the most cynical doctors at St. Jude's. Marcus Harrison, the adoption papers had been finalized during his recovery, sat on Emma's favorite bench, his dark curls growing back thick and healthy, his cheeks full of color that spoke of regular meals and peaceful sleep. The port in his chest had been removed last week, leaving only a small scar that Dr. Chen said would fade with time. Complete molecular remission, she had told them during their final appointment in Memphis. Marcus's T-cells didn't just defeat the cancer, They've created an immune response so strong that we're using his case as a model for future treatments. In 27 years of pediatric oncology, I've never seen anything quite like it. But Marcus knew the real miracle wasn't medical. It was sitting beside him now, carefully counting ice cubes in her water bottle with the focused intensity that meant she was processing something important. "Emma," he said gently, "what are you thinking about?" "And de-bubble magic," she replied, her vocabulary and emotional expression having expanded dramatically during the months when Marcus fought for his life. "I always knew bubble boys were the strongest magic, even stronger than cancer magic." Marcus smiled, reaching into his backpack for the professional bubble-making kit Richard had bought him, complete with 6 different solution formulas and wands designed by scientists to create the most spectacular bubbles possible. But Emma shook her head and pointed to something else. In the corner of his bag sat the original cracked plastic container, patched with medical tape and still holding the simple mixture of dish soap and water that had started everything. "Original magic is strongest magic," Emma said with 7-year-old wisdom that astounded the therapists who worked with her. As Marcus dipped the makeshift wand into his first bubble solution, a familiar silver Bentley pulled into the parking lot. But this time, Richard didn't hide behind tinted windows. He climbed out with Sarah, both of them carrying picnic baskets and blankets for what had become their weekly family tradition. "How are my favorite bubble scientists today?" Richard called out, his voice carrying a lightness that would have been impossible to imagine during those terrifying weeks in Memphis. "Uncle Richard!" Marcus jumped up and ran to him with energy that still amazed everyone who'd seen him at his sickest. "Dr. Chen called this morning. The research team wants to name the new treatment protocol after me. The Marcus Harrison method," Richard said, pulling his nephew into a fierce hug. "It has a nice ring to it." "Actually," Marcus said, stepping back with a serious expression, "I told them I wanted it named after Dad, the David Thompson Protocol. He's the one who made it possible." Richard's eyes filled with tears that no longer embarrassed him. In learning to fight for Marcus, he'd also learned to feel again, to let love be stronger than pride or fear. "Your father would be so proud," he whispered, "not just of your recovery, but of the man you're becoming." As they spread blankets on the grass and unpacked sandwiches made by the housekeeper who'd become like a grandmother to both children, Marcus felt the kind of complete happiness he'd never known existed. Emma sat beside him, chattering about her new school friends and the art therapy class where she painted pictures of bubbles that her teachers said showed remarkable emotional intelligence. "Marcus," Sarah said as they finished eating, "there's something Richard and I wanted to discuss with you." Marcus felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Even surrounded by love and security, the street kid in him remained alert for signs that good things were ending. "Dr. Chen contacted us last week," Richard continued. "Not about your health. You're completely cured, and that's never going to change, but about something else. The Research Foundation Board wants to offer you something unprecedented," Sarah added. "A scholarship fund that would pay for your education through medical school, if that's something you're interested in pursuing." Marcus stared at them, trying to process what they were saying. "You mean I could become a doctor, like Dr. Chen?" "You could become anything you want," Richard said firmly, "but they specifically mentioned pediatric oncology. Apparently, some of the young patients at St. Jude's have been asking for the Bubble Boy doctor ever since they heard your story." The idea hit Marcus like a revelation. He could spend his life helping kids like he used to be, scared, alone, fighting impossible battles. He could be the person he'd needed when he was struggling on the streets and later in the hospital. "I want to do it," he said without hesitation. "I want to help kids who feel like nobody cares about them." Emma suddenly stood up and walked to Marcus with purpose. From her pocket, she pulled out a small glass vial filled with shimmering liquid that caught the afternoon light like liquid starlight. "Special bubble solution," she announced. "Made it with Grandma Sarah, for kids in hospitals who need magic." Marcus took the vial with hands that trembled slightly. The simple gesture represented everything beautiful about the family he'd found, their instinct to nurture, to share their gifts, to make the world better for the most vulnerable people in it. "Should we test it?" he asked, unscrewing the cap. What happened next would become family legend. The bubbles that emerged from Emma's special solution weren't just beautiful. They seemed to dance on air currents that defied physics, creating patterns that looked almost choreographed. Children from across the park began gathering, drawn by something they couldn't name, but recognized instinctively. A little girl about Emma's age, clearly struggling with some invisible anxiety, watched with growing calm as the bubbles surrounded her. A boy on crutches forgot about his disability and laughed for the first time in weeks. Parents who'd been stressed and distracted found themselves smiling, remembering what wonder felt like. "It's not the bubbles," Richard said quietly, watching Marcus work his magic on a group of strangers who'd become an impromptu audience. "It's never been the bubbles. It's love," Sarah agreed. "It's seeing people who need healing and choosing to heal them." As the sun began setting over Riverside Park, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility, Marcus packed up his bubble supplies with the careful attention of someone who understood their true value. These weren't just toys or distractions. They were tools for connection, for healing, for reminding people that magic existed in the space between hearts that chose to care for each other. "Uncle Richard," Marcus said as they walked back to the car, Emma's hand secure in his. "Do you think Dad would be proud of who I'm becoming?" Richard stopped walking and knelt down to Marcus's level, just as he had during their first conversation in this same park almost a year ago. "Son, I think David sent you to us not just so we could save you, but so you could save us too. You taught Emma how to trust. You taught me how to love without condition. You taught Sarah how powerful it is to fight for someone who matters. And now you're going to teach other kids that being different doesn't mean being broken, that being sick doesn't mean being hopeless, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose for ourselves." As they drove home through the Chicago streets that had once been Marcus's hostile territory and were now simply the backdrop to his extraordinary life, Marcus Harrison closed his eyes and felt the presence of a father he'd never really known, but whose love had traveled through time and circumstance to bring him exactly where he belonged. Tomorrow, he would start preparing for a future that seemed as limitless as the bubbles that had started this miraculous journey. Tonight, he was simply a little boy going home with his family, carrying enough love in his heart to heal the world, one bubble at a time. The magic had never been in the soap and water. The magic had always been in the choice to care, to connect, to believe that everyone deserved to be seen and loved and saved. And that magic, Marcus now knew, was strong enough to last forever.